Have you ever wondered what forges a people into the most feared warriors of their time? Long before the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire dominated the ancient world with its iron fist, a transformation was taking place. This is the story of how a nation of merchants and farmers became a relentless military machine. This is the story of Assyria before the empire. Our journey begins in northern Mesopotamia, in the heartland of Assyria, centered around the ancient city of Ashur. For centuries, this region was a crossroads of civilizations, often overshadowed and controlled by more powerful neighbors like the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Mitanni. The early Assyrians weren't conquerors, they were survivors. Their lands were fertile but exposed, lacking natural barriers like mountains or deserts. This constant vulnerability meant one thing: to survive, they had to be able to fight. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Imagine living in a land where at any moment, a rival kingdom could sweep in from the south or raiders could descend from the Zagros Mountains to the east. This perpetual threat became the crucible in which the Assyrian warrior spirit was forged. Early on, their military was primarily defensive, a citizen militia called upon to protect their homes and trade routes. But every raid they repelled, every skirmish they won, added to a growing body of military knowledge and a hardening resolve. A pivotal moment came during the Middle Assyrian period, around the 14th century BCE, under ambitious kings like Ashur-uballit I. Assyria began to shake off the yoke of foreign domination. They saw weakness in their neighbors and seized the opportunity. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about projecting power. They started launching campaigns to secure their borders, creating buffer zones to keep enemies at a distance. These early campaigns were brutal and efficient, designed to send a clear message: Assyria is no longer a prize to be won. It is a power to be feared. What made them so effective? Three key elements began to define their military approach: organization, technology, and psychology. First, organization. The Assyrians were meticulous planners. They understood that a successful army wasn't just about brave soldiers. It was about logistics. They developed sophisticated supply chains to keep their armies fed and equipped on long campaigns. Their military structure became more professionalized. Instead of just farmers taking up arms, a corps of dedicated soldiers emerged, led by a king who was not just a ruler but the supreme commander, often leading his troops into battle himself. This created a strong centralized command structure that could react quickly and decisively. Second, technology. The Assyrians were masters of adopting and perfecting military innovations. While their neighbors were still relying heavily on bronze, the Assyrians began to embrace a new wonder material: iron. Iron was harder, more durable, and crucially, more abundant than the components of bronze. This meant they could equip a larger number of soldiers with superior weapons and armor. An Assyrian soldier clad in an iron-tipped helmet, carrying an iron sword and spear, was a formidable opponent. But their most terrifying innovation was in siege warfare. They became the undisputed masters of taking down fortified cities. They didn't just surround a city and wait for it to starve. They brought an entire engineering corps with them. They built massive siege towers that could roll up to the city walls, allowing their archers to rain down arrows from above. They constructed huge earthen ramps to bypass fortifications. And most famously, they perfected the battering ram, not just a simple log, but a sophisticated armored machine, sometimes with multiple heads, capable of punching through the thickest mud brick walls. For a city's defenders, the sight of the Assyrian siege camp being set up on the horizon was the beginning of the end. This brings us to the third element: psychology. The Assyrians understood that war is won not just on the battlefield, but in the mind of the enemy. They cultivated a reputation for calculated cruelty and utter ruthlessness. Their goal was to make the very idea of resisting them seem futile. Assyrian royal inscriptions and palace reliefs, which we can still see today, weren't just art. They were propaganda. They vividly depicted the gruesome fates of those who dared to defy Assyria. Cities burned to the ground, leaders executed, and populations deported and scattered across the empire. This policy of mass deportation was a particularly effective tool of control. By uprooting entire communities and moving them to different parts of their growing territory, the Assyrians broke local loyalties and identities. It served a dual purpose. It terrified others into submission and provided a mobile workforce for the state's building projects. The message was chillingly clear: surrender, and you might live as subjects of Assyria. Resist, and you will face annihilation and oblivion. So let's piece this together. We have a society born from a need for survival, hardened by constant conflict. They developed a professional, well-organized army led by a warrior king. They armed this army with the latest iron technology and backed it with an unparalleled siege machine. And they wrapped it all in a terrifying psychological campaign that demoralized their enemies before the first arrow was even fired. This wasn't yet the vast Neo-Assyrian Empire that would stretch from Egypt to Iran. This was the foundation. This was the long, brutal process of a people transforming themselves. The warrior society that emerged from this period was disciplined, innovative, and merciless. They weren't just fighting for land or resources anymore. They were fighting for a divinely ordained destiny, believing their god Ashur commanded them to expand and bring order to the world, an order defined by Assyrian rule. When the time was right, with the rise of legendary kings like Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE, this perfectly honed military machine would be unleashed upon the ancient Near East. The world had seen powerful armies before, but it had never seen anything quite like the Assyrians. They had spent centuries preparing for their moment on the world stage, turning their vulnerability into their greatest strength. The age of the Assyrian Empire was about to begin, built on the back of the most formidable warrior society the world had ever known. Ever wondered how an empire could dominate the ancient world for centuries? How they could build a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, even conquering Egypt? The answer lies with one of the most formidable military forces in history, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For nearly 400 years, from around 911 to 609 BC, they were the undisputed superpower of their time. Their name alone struck fear into the hearts of kings and commoners alike. But how did they do it? What was the secret behind their seemingly unstoppable war machine? It wasn't just brute force. It was a combination of groundbreaking technology, brilliant organization, and a terrifying psychological edge that made them legends. Today, we're diving deep into the heartland of ancient Ashur to uncover the secrets of the Assyrian army. A force that didn't just win battles, it rewrote the rules of warfare and shaped the course of history itself. So, prepare to march alongside the legions of Assyria as we explore how they built an empire that would be remembered for millennia. Let's start with the tools of the trade. While other armies were still relying heavily on bronze, the Assyrians were the pioneers of the Iron Age military. They were among the first to equip their soldiers with iron weapons on a massive scale. Think about the advantage. Iron swords, spearheads, and arrowheads were not only stronger and more durable than their bronze counterparts, but the raw material was also more abundant. This meant they could field larger, better-equipped armies than any of their rivals. An Assyrian infantryman, clad in a pointed iron helmet and lamellar armor, carrying a large shield and a sharp iron sword, was a truly intimidating sight. But their innovation didn't stop at personal gear. The Assyrians were, above all, master engineers. They established the world's first dedicated permanent corps of engineers. These weren't just soldiers who knew how to build a bridge. They were specialists in the art of the siege. When the Assyrian army arrived at a walled city, they brought with them a terrifying arsenal of siege technology. They had massive, wheeled siege towers, often several stories high, that allowed archers to shoot down at the defenders on the walls. These towers sometimes even had a battering ram built into the base. Speaking of battering rams, the Assyrians perfected them. Theirs were not just simple logs. They were complex machines covered in damp leather to protect them from fire, with powerful iron-tipped heads designed to smash through stone and brick. They also used sophisticated ramps and earthworks to bring these engines right up to the city walls, and deployed teams of sappers, specialist miners to dig tunnels and undermine the enemy's foundations. For the Assyrians, a fortified city wasn't an obstacle. It was a puzzle to be solved with engineering and overwhelming force. They documented their sieges in incredible detail on palace reliefs, showing every aspect of the assault, from the archers providing covering fire to the final storming of the walls with ladders. This technological superiority meant that no city, no matter how well defended, was truly safe from the Assyrian wrath. But having the best weapons and technology is useless without a disciplined and organized army to wield them. This is where the Assyrians truly excelled. Their army was a professional, standing force, a concept that was revolutionary for its time. It was a highly structured war machine, divided into distinct units: infantry, cavalry, and the devastatingly effective chariot corps. The infantry was the backbone, with spearmen forming solid phalanxes and archers raining down death from a distance. The cavalry, equipped with lances and bows, were perfect for scouting, flanking maneuvers, and pursuing fleeing enemies. And the chariots, which evolved from heavy 4-horse platforms to lighter, faster 2-horse models, acted as mobile missile platforms and shock troops, breaking enemy lines and creating chaos. What truly set them apart, however, was their logistical genius. An empire this vast couldn't be run by an army that lived off the land. The Assyrians understood this. They built an extensive network of royal roads across their domain, allowing troops and supplies to move with unprecedented speed. Along these roads, they established a system of supply depots, pre-stocked with food, water, and equipment, ensuring their army could campaign far from home without running out of resources. This logistical support was a force multiplier, enabling them to launch surprise attacks and sustain long sieges that would have exhausted any other army. Furthermore, they created a brilliant communication network. Using a relay system of mounted messengers, similar to the later Pony Express, they could transmit orders and intelligence across the empire in a matter of days. A king in the capital of Nineveh could receive a report from a governor in Egypt and send back a reply with astonishing speed. This combination of a professional army, specialized units, and a sophisticated support system made the Assyrian military a truly modern force in an ancient world. Now, let's talk about the Assyrians' most infamous weapon: fear. They were masters of psychological warfare. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to terrify them into submission. They deliberately cultivated a reputation for extreme brutality, and they made sure everyone knew about it. Their own official records, carved on the palace walls and public monuments for all to see, graphically depict the fates of those who dared to resist. These reliefs show cities being burned, captives being flayed alive, impaled on stakes, or blinded. The inscriptions boast of the destruction and slaughter they wrought. Was all of this just propaganda? Not entirely. While likely exaggerated for effect, the archaeological evidence and accounts from other nations confirm their ruthless tactics. The goal wasn't just mindless cruelty. It was a calculated strategy. The stories of Assyrian retribution would spread far and wide, often reaching a city long before the army itself did. Faced with the choice between surrender, which often meant paying a hefty tribute, and accepting Assyrian rule and annihilation, many cities chose the former. They would open their gates without a fight, saving the Assyrians the time, resources, and manpower of a lengthy siege. This psychological warfare was incredibly effective. It allowed them to expand and control their vast empire with a military that, while large, was still finite. They couldn't be everywhere at once, but their reputation could. This fearsome image became a tool of statecraft, a way to maintain order and discourage rebellion through sheer terror. It was a dark and brutal strategy, but undeniably a key component of their imperial success. So what happened to this unstoppable force? Like all great empires, the Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually fell. A combination of internal strife, overexpansion, and a series of powerful rebellions, most notably from the Babylonians and the Medes, brought the empire to its knees. In 612 BC, their magnificent capital, Nineveh, was sacked and burned. A shocking end for a power that had seemed invincible for so long. But their legacy endured. The Assyrian model of warfare and imperial administration didn't disappear with them. The empires that followed, particularly the Neo-Babylonians and the Achaemenid Persians, learned from their predecessors. They adopted and adapted Assyrian military structures, engineering techniques, and administrative systems. The Persian road network and relay system, for example, were clear descendants of the Assyrian model. The Assyrians had set a new standard for what an empire could be. They showed the world the power of a professional, technologically advanced army combined with brilliant logistics and psychological dominance. They were the architects of a new kind of warfare, one based on science, engineering, and total strategy. From their iron weapons and siege engines to their professional military and communication networks, the innovations of the Neo-Assyrian Empire fundamentally changed the ancient Near East and laid the groundwork for the great empires that would follow. They were a brutal, terrifying force, but their impact on history is undeniable. Their story is a powerful reminder that throughout history, military innovation has been a key driver of change, shaping borders, toppling kingdoms, and forging empires. Imagine an empire so fearsome, its very name was whispered in terror across the ancient world. An empire whose kings were not just rulers, but living weapons, whose armies were unstoppable, and whose cruelty was legendary. This was the Assyrian Empire, a military superpower that dominated the Near East for centuries. But how did they build such a terrifying reputation? And what lessons can we learn from their spectacular rise and fall? Today, we journey back in time to uncover the secrets of the world's first true empire and its brutal methods of control. For the Assyrians, cruelty wasn't just a byproduct of war. It was a deliberate and calculated state policy. Their goal was simple: to instill so much fear in their enemies that the very thought of rebellion would be unthinkable. When the Assyrian army arrived at your city gates, you had two choices: surrender immediately and pay a heavy tribute, or resist and face annihilation. Their military was a marvel of its time. They perfected siege warfare, developing massive wheeled siege towers that could roll up to city walls, complete with battering rams at the base and archers at the top. They were masters of digging tunnels to undermine foundations, causing walls to collapse. They could even block or divert rivers to cut off a city's water supply. Resistance was, for most, a death sentence. And the Assyrians made sure everyone knew the price of defiance. Their kings didn't hide their brutality. They advertised it. After a successful conquest, they would engage in systematic, horrifying acts of cruelty. Survivors would be impaled on stakes and displayed outside the city walls as a grotesque warning to others. They would be flayed alive, their skin hung on the ramparts. Leaders of rebellions were subjected to particularly gruesome fates, often being blinded, having their tongues torn out, or being forced to wear the severed heads of their own nobles around their necks. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated psychological warfare, designed to break the will of anyone who dared to oppose Assyrian might. The message was brutally clear: we are in charge, and this is what happens when you forget it. But sheer terror was only one part of their strategy. The Assyrians were also masters of propaganda, crafting a powerful image of divine right and unstoppable power. The kings presented themselves as the chosen regents of their supreme god, Ashur. Every conquest, every victory, was framed as the execution of Ashur's divine will. This ideology gave their soldiers a religious fervor and justified their expansionist policies. The king was more than a monarch. He was the earthly embodiment of a celestial warrior, destined to bring order to a chaotic world, one bloody conquest at a time. This divine mandate was a powerful tool for unifying their own people and demoralizing their enemies. Who could stand against a king who had the gods on his side? This propaganda was carved in stone for all to see. The magnificent palaces at cities like Nineveh and Nimrud were not just royal residences. They were monumental propaganda machines. Their walls were lined with thousands of square feet of incredibly detailed stone reliefs. These weren't just decorations. They were a visual narrative of Assyrian power. You would see panel after panel depicting the king as a peerless warrior, leading the charge in his chariot, single-handedly slaying enemies. You'd see scenes of Assyrian siege engines overwhelming fortified cities and the subsequent brutal punishment of the defeated. Alongside these war scenes were depictions of the king as the ultimate hunter, wrestling lions with his bare hands or hunting them from his chariot. This projected an image of a ruler who could master both the chaos of war and the chaos of nature. It was a constant, intimidating reminder to any visiting dignitary or subject of who held the power. Perhaps the most unique and insidious form of their psychological warfare was a practice we might call godnapping. In the ancient world, each city had its own patron god or goddess, whose statue resided in the main temple. This statue was believed to be the physical home of the deity. When the Assyrians conquered a particularly defiant city, they would march into the temple and carry off the statue of its god, taking it back to Assyria. This was a devastating blow to the conquered people. It wasn't just the loss of a precious artifact. It was as if their divine protector had abandoned them, or worse, had been defeated and captured by the Assyrian god, Ashur. It was a spiritual and psychological decapitation, leaving the people feeling hopeless and completely subjugated, not just militarily, but divinely. Yet, an empire cannot run on fear and propaganda alone. Beneath the iron fist was a surprisingly sophisticated and efficient administrative system. Once a territory was conquered and pacified, it was integrated into a vast imperial network. The empire was divided into provinces, each run by a governor who was directly accountable to the king. These governors were responsible for collecting tribute, enforcing Assyrian law, and raising troops for the army. To connect this sprawling empire, the Assyrians developed the first state-run communication system in history. A network of royal roads was built, with way stations positioned roughly a day's journey apart. At each station, fresh horses and messengers were ready to go at a moment's notice. This Pony Express system allowed the king to send orders and receive intelligence from the farthest corners of his empire with unprecedented speed, enabling him to react quickly to any signs of unrest. This administrative framework also facilitated trade and economic prosperity, at least for the Assyrian heartland. The tribute and resources plundered from conquered lands flowed into the capital cities, funding the construction of monumental palaces, temples, and canals. Skilled craftsmen and scholars were forcibly relocated from across the empire to contribute their talents to the glory of Assyria. This created a cosmopolitan, albeit coerced, society in the core cities. While the provinces were bled dry to support the imperial center, the system worked, allowing the empire to thrive for centuries and manage a territory that stretched from modern-day Iran all the way to Egypt. So with such a powerful military, a masterful propaganda machine, and an efficient administration, how did it all come crashing down? In the end, the very foundation of the Assyrian Empire, fear proved to be its greatest weakness. An empire built on brutality breeds resentment, not loyalty. For centuries, the conquered peoples of the Near East seethed under Assyrian rule, waiting for a moment of weakness. That moment arrived in the late 7th century BCE. A series of civil wars over the succession to the throne severely weakened the central authority and drained the military. Seeing their chance, a coalition of long-suffering subjects, led by the Babylonians from the south and the Medes from the east, rose in a massive coordinated rebellion. This time, the terror tactics backfired. The rebels, fueled by generations of hatred, fought with a desperation and ferocity that matched the Assyrians' own. They had learned from their oppressors. One by one, the great Assyrian cities, once thought to be impregnable, were besieged and captured. In 612 BCE, the grand capital of Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, fell. The victorious armies enacted a terrible revenge, burning the city to the ground and slaughtering its inhabitants, giving the Assyrians a taste of their own brutal medicine. The destruction was so complete that the Assyrian Empire was effectively erased from history, its great cities buried under mounds of earth, its very existence forgotten for over 2,000 years until archaeologists rediscovered their ruins in the 19th century. The story of the Assyrian Empire is a stark cautionary tale. It shows that while power can be seized through violence and maintained for a time through terror, a regime built on fear is inherently unstable. It creates a brittle foundation that is destined to crack under pressure. True, lasting strength comes not from inspiring fear, but from fostering loyalty, cooperation, and a shared sense of purpose. The Assyrians were masters of conquest, but they failed to learn the art of winning hearts and minds. Their legacy, carved in stone and written in blood, serves as a timeless warning that empires built on cruelty will eventually be consumed by the hatred they create. Imagine a city so vast its walls stretched for miles, a metropolis that was the beating heart of the ancient world. A place where knowledge was more valuable than gold, and the king was not just a conqueror, but a scholar. This wasn't Rome or Athens. This was Nineveh, the mighty capital of the Assyrian Empire. For centuries, its name echoed with fear and awe. But beyond the tales of warfare lies a different story, one of a civilization obsessed with understanding the universe, and a king who built a library to hold all the knowledge of the world. Today, we read Journeying Back in Time to uncover the hidden mind of Assyria and explore the spectacular ruins of Nineveh. So what made Nineveh the powerhouse of the ancient Near East? Location. Situated on the eastern bank of the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq, Nineveh was at a crucial crossroads of trade and military routes. This strategic position allowed the Assyrians to control vast territories from Egypt to Persia. But it wasn't just about geography. The Assyrians were master engineers and administrators. They built incredible canals and aqueducts to bring water to the city, turning the arid landscape into a lush garden. The city itself was a marvel, enclosed by a massive double wall punctuated by 15 grand gates, each dedicated to an Assyrian god. It was a statement of power, a fortress city designed to impress and intimidate. Walking through the streets of ancient Nineveh would have been an overwhelming experience. Imagine bustling markets filled with goods from across the empire, cedar from Lebanon, precious metals from Anatolia, exotic spices from the east. The air would be thick with the sounds of a dozen different languages and the smell of cooking fires and incense. The architecture was monumental. Palaces adorned with intricate reliefs depicting scenes of conquest, royal hunts, and religious ceremonies. These weren't just decorations. They were propaganda, a visual narrative of Assyrian might designed to remind everyone who was in charge. The sheer scale of the city, home to over 100,000 people, made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. At the heart of this sprawling metropolis stood the palaces of the Assyrian kings. The most famous was the Palace Without a Rival, built by King Sennacherib. Its name says it all. This wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of imperial dominance. Its rooms were lined with an estimated 2 miles of carved stone reliefs, telling the story of Sennacherib's military campaigns in vivid detail. We see Assyrian soldiers besieging cities, scaling walls with ladders, and leading away captives. These carvings are a goldmine for historians, providing a detailed, albeit biased, account of Assyrian warfare and daily life. But another king would take Nineveh to an even greater height, not through war but through wisdom. Enter Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. While he was a formidable warrior like his predecessors, his true passion was knowledge. He was one of the few kings of his time who could read and write, and he was fluent in multiple languages, including the ancient Sumerian. Ashurbanipal was driven by an insatiable curiosity and a desire to preserve the wisdom of the past. He believed that knowledge was a tool of power, a way to understand the will of the gods and secure the future of his empire. So he embarked on an ambitious project, to create a library that would contain every piece of written knowledge in his kingdom. This wasn't just a small collection of scrolls. Ashurbanipal sent scribes across Mesopotamia to collect and copy texts from temple archives and older libraries. He gathered tens of thousands of clay tablets on every imaginable subject: medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, mythology, and literature. There were dictionaries, omen texts for predicting the future, magical incantations, and epic poems. The most famous text discovered in his library is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest works of literature, containing a flood story that has fascinating parallels with the biblical account of Noah's Ark. This library was the first systematically collected and cataloged library in the world, a true monument to the human intellect. The knowledge stored in Ashurbanipal's library gives us a unique window into the Assyrian mind. They weren't just brutal warriors, they were keen observers of the natural world. Their astronomers meticulously tracked the movements of the stars and planets, not just for religious purposes, but to create an accurate calendar and predict eclipses. Their medical texts describe diagnoses and treatments for various ailments, combining practical remedies with magical rituals. They developed sophisticated mathematics and engineering to build their monumental cities and complex irrigation systems. This was a civilization that valued order, precision, and the power of information. The library was the brain of the empire, a central repository of data that helped the king govern his vast and complex realm. But like all great empires, Assyria's dominance was not to last. A coalition of their enemies, the Babylonians and the Medes, rose up against them. In 612 BC, after a brutal siege, the mighty city of Nineveh fell. The grand palaces were looted and burned, and the city was left in ruins. For over 2,000 years, Nineveh was lost to history, its location remembered only through biblical and classical texts, where it was described as a wicked city that met a divine punishment. Its grand walls crumbled to dust, and its story was buried beneath layers of earth, becoming little more than a legend. The great mind of Assyria went silent. Then, in the mid-19th century, a new age of exploration began. European archaeologists, drawn by the biblical stories, began digging in the mysterious mounds near the modern city of Mosul. What they found was beyond their wildest dreams. They unearthed the colossal winged bull statues that once guarded the palace gates, the stunning reliefs of Sennacherib, and most importantly, the scattered fire-hardened remains of Ashurbanipal's library. The fire that had destroyed the city had inadvertently preserved the clay tablets, baking them solid and protecting the cuneiform script for millennia. Suddenly, the lost world of Assyria began to speak again. The decipherment of these tablets transformed our understanding of the ancient world. It was like finding a time capsule, a direct link to the thoughts, beliefs, and daily lives of the Assyrians. Today, the legacy of Nineveh and the knowledge from Ashurbanipal's library continue to fascinate scholars and the public alike. The artifacts are displayed in museums around the world, testaments to a civilization of incredible complexity and ambition. The story of Nineveh is a powerful reminder that history is not just a tale of kings and battles. It's also a story of ideas, of the relentless human quest for knowledge, and of how even the mightiest empires can fall, but the words they leave behind can echo through eternity. Imagine an empire so vast it stretched from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the peaks of the Caucasus down to the sands of Egypt. This was the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the superpower of its day. For 3 centuries, its name was synonymous with absolute power. Its armies, a marvel of military engineering and brutal efficiency, were the most feared fighting force the world had ever seen. Cities like Nimrud, Ashur, and the legendary Nineveh were jewels of the ancient world, adorned with magnificent palaces, towering ziggurats, and walls so thick they were said to be impenetrable. The kings of Assyria, names like Ashurbanipal, were not just rulers. They were living gods, high priests, and supreme commanders whose words were law. From the outside, the empire seemed eternal, a bronze and iron giant destined to rule forever. But even the mightiest giants have feet of clay, and unseen cracks were already beginning to spread through the foundations of this colossal power. While the empire projected an image of invincible strength, internally, it was rotting from the core. The very system that fueled its expansion, constant warfare, was becoming its undoing. The endless campaigns drained the treasury and stretched the army thin across a sprawling territory that was becoming impossible to govern effectively. Succession was rarely a peaceful affair. The death of a king often triggered bloody civil wars as sons, brothers, and powerful generals vied for the throne. These internal conflicts were not just palace intrigues. They tore the empire apart, pitting province against province and legion against legion. The social fabric was also fraying. The constant demand for soldiers and labor placed an immense burden on the common people. Heavy taxes and forced conscription led to widespread resentment and simmering unrest. The farther you traveled from the Assyrian heartland, the more a conquered people saw themselves not as subjects, but as slaves waiting for their moment to break the chains. All this political and social turmoil created the perfect storm, a deep-seated weakness that its enemies were beginning to notice. Then came a disaster that no army could fight, no king could command. Nature itself turned against the empire. Scientific analysis of ancient climate records has revealed a chilling truth. The late 7th century BC saw the onset of a catastrophic megadrought. For decades, the rains failed. The mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, dwindled. What were once lush, fertile fields that fed the empire's cities and armies turned into cracked, barren earth. Harvests failed year after year, leading to severe famine. The granaries, once overflowing with the spoils of conquest, fell empty. Starvation stalked the land, and with it came disease and desperation. The economic engine of the empire sputtered and died. The state could no longer afford to pay its soldiers, maintain its vast infrastructure, or even feed its own people. The once unquestionable authority of the king began to crumble as he proved powerless against the wrath of the heavens. This climate-induced crisis was the tipping point, weakening the Assyrian giant and leaving it vulnerable, gasping for breath, just as its most determined enemies began to circle. Sensing weakness, the vultures began to gather. For centuries, the peoples conquered by Assyria had suffered under its iron fist. Now they saw their chance for revenge. Chief among them were the Babylonians to the south. Once a vassal state, Babylonia had a long and proud history, and it never truly accepted Assyrian rule. A charismatic and cunning leader named Nabopolassar rose to power, declaring Babylon's independence and igniting a full-scale rebellion. He wasn't alone. To the east, in the mountains of modern-day Iran, a new power was emerging. The Medes, a confederation of fierce nomadic tribes. The Medes had been united under their king Sagiseres into a formidable military force. They too had suffered from Assyrian raids and sought not just freedom, but the complete destruction of their oppressor. The old saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," rang true. Nabopolassar and Sayaseres formed a powerful coalition. The Babylonians brought strategic brilliance and a deep-seated desire to reclaim their legacy, while the Medes brought hordes of hardy warriors, masters of cavalry warfare. This alliance of convenience, forged in a shared hatred of Assyria, created a two-front war that the beleaguered empire, ravaged by internal strife and famine, simply could not handle. The stage was set for the final bloody act. The year is 612 BC. The grand coalition of Babylonians and Medes stands before the walls of Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire. For centuries, Nineveh had been called the City of Blood, a testament to the wealth it had plundered and the terror it had inspired. Its fortifications were the stuff of legend, a massive outer wall over 7 miles long, protected by a deep moat and 15 great gates, each named after an Assyrian god. The defenders, led by King Sin-shar-ishkon, fought with the desperation of a people facing annihilation. But the attackers were relentless. Ancient chronicles describe a brutal 3-month siege. The coalition forces may have used the very rivers against the city, diverting their flow to undermine the mud brick foundations of the walls. Finally, a breach was made. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The invading armies poured into the city, fueled by generations of pent-up hatred. They showed no mercy. The city was systematically plundered, its magnificent temples and palaces stripped of their treasures. Great fires were set, consuming the cedarwood beams and ornate tapestries. The blaze was so intense it baked the clay tablets in the royal library, ironically preserving them for future archaeologists. The sack of Nineveh was more than a military victory. It was an act of symbolic annihilation. The jewel of the Assyrian Empire was reduced to a smoking ruin, and its king perished in the flames of his own palace. Even with the fall of its capital, the Assyrian spirit was not entirely extinguished. A small remnant of the Assyrian army managed to escape the carnage at Nineveh and flee westward. They rallied around a general who declared himself the new king, Ashur-uballit II. He established a new makeshift capital in the city of Haran, hoping to regroup and, with the help of his Egyptian allies, reclaim his lost empire. For a few years, this pocket of resistance held out, a ghost of the former superpower. Ashur-uballit desperately tried to muster support, clinging to the hope that the Assyrian lion could still roar. But his cause was doomed. In 609 BC, the combined Babylonian and Median forces marched on Haran. The Egyptians, Assyria's last hope, were defeated on their way to provide aid. Haran fell, and Ashur-uballit II vanished from the historical record, likely killed in the fighting. This was the final nail in the coffin. With his death, the last vestige of Assyrian statehood was wiped from the face of the earth. The resistance collapsed, and the remaining Assyrian garrisons were mopped up one by one. The great empire was no more. So how could an empire that had dominated the world for 300 years vanish so completely, so suddenly? It was a perfect storm of internal decay, climate catastrophe, and external pressure. Decades of civil war weakened it from within. A crippling megadrought destroyed its economy and starved its people. And this vulnerability was ruthlessly exploited by a coalition of enemies bent on total destruction. The Babylonians and Medes didn't just conquer Assyria, they erased it. They destroyed its cities, deported its people, and dismantled its administration. Within a generation, the very name of Assyria faded into myth. 2 centuries later, when the Greek historian Xenophon marched through the region, he saw the colossal ruins of its cities but had no idea who had built them. The world's greatest empire had been so thoroughly wiped out that it was forgotten. Its story was lost to time until the 19th century, when archaeologists began to dig in the sands of Iraq. They unearthed the buried palaces, and most importantly, the vast libraries of clay tablets. On these baked clay records, written in cuneiform script, the Assyrians told their own story of their triumphs, their kings, their gods, and ultimately, their spectacular fall. The mighty empire that disappeared from history had left behind its own voice, waiting patiently in the earth to be heard once more. Thank you so much for watching. The rise and fall of great civilizations is a powerful reminder of how even the mightiest can crumble. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments which lost empire you'd like to see us explore next. See you in the next video.